Get out if you can't pay, old man. We're not a shelter. The server's voice cut through the diner like a slap across the face. The room fell silent as Raymond Ellis, 83, proud but weathered, reached for his spilled canvas bag. His medals clattered onto the linoleum floor. No one moved. No one helped. He gathered his dignity and shaking hands, stood slowly, and walked out without a word. But the story didn't end there. Because 1 hour later, a military helicopter landed in the parking lot. A commander stepped out and with one sentence, he shut the place down. What the staff didn't know, they had just humiliated the man who trained America's finest and the father of the one who came to shut them down. The American flag rippled gently in the Georgia morning breeze, rising slowly on a pole outside a modest brick home with peeling paint and flower beds long past their bloom. Franklin Ward stood at full attention, back straight, eyes level, one hand pressed firmly over his heart. He didn't recite the pledge. He never had to. The years he spent living it were stitched into the lines around his eyes in the rigid way he held himself, even now at 83. Every morning was the same. Flag up at dawn, coffee black and bitter by 6:15. Then a slow, measured walk, cane in one hand, canvas bag in the other, toward the old church building, repurposed into the local veteran center. It wasn't much, a leaky roof, fluorescent lights that hummed louder than most of the men who gathered there. But to Franklin, it was sacred ground. These were his people, soldiers, sailors, airmen, some broken in body, many in spirit, all clinging to a sliver of something they couldn't quite name. He didn't talk much. He mostly listened. Younger vets with shaky voices would sit beside him, hands trembling around styrofoam coffee cups, and just speak about dreams they couldn't wake from, about trying to build lives in a world that moved too fast and cared too little. Franklin never offered advice unless they asked. Most of the time, they didn't need answers, just someone who wouldn't flinch at the stories they carried. His presence alone did something. Not because he told war stories. In fact, he didn't. It was the way he sat, still and grounded, as if he were holding down the room so no one else had to. That morning, however, Franklin's schedule shifted. No stop at the center, no familiar nods to the regulars. Instead, he wore a freshly pressed shirt under his old olive jacket and checked the contents of his canvas bag 3 times before locking the front door. He was meeting his son, Colonel Nathan Ward, recently appointed to command U.S. Special Forces operations after a series of highly classified missions overseas. The title meant nothing to Franklin in terms of status. What mattered to him wasn't his son's rank. It was the man Nathan had become. Calm under pressure, fiercely ethical, always respectful. Franklin never pushed military service on his boy. Never once said, "Follow in my footsteps." But Nathan had followed anyway and made his own path out of the same gravel and grit. It had been nearly 6 months since they'd seen each other in person. Brief calls here and there, usually cut short by poor reception or secure line restrictions. So when Nathan had told him just a day ago that he'd be flying through the state and had an hour to spare between assignments, Franklin didn't hesitate. He'd suggested a diner about halfway between the airfield and the highway. A quiet spot with good pie and strong coffee. Nathan had offered to send a transport vehicle. "We'll swing by and pick you up, Dad. One of the guys can." "No need." Franklin had interrupted. "I know the route. Took it plenty in my younger days. Bus still runs it." Nathan chuckled. "It does." "You sure?" "I'm not dead yet." Which was true, though some days his niece made a convincing argument otherwise. Franklin had memorized the bus schedule the night before, planning 2 transfers with surgical precision. He left 2 hours early just in case. His joints ached even before he stepped onto the first faded blue city bus, but he didn't complain. Pain was an old companion, and in Franklin's world, old companions didn't require acknowledgement. He sat by the window, back straight as always, eyes scanning the Georgia countryside as it rolled past like a slow reel of memory, pine trees, broken fences, rusted gas stations. His mind wandered, but never too far. He was focused on what mattered. He'd brought something with him. A small wooden box tucked inside the canvas bag. It held no money, just meaning. Inside were Nathan's childhood photos, a bronze star, a silver star, and a letter that Franklin had once written and never mailed. He wasn't sure he'd give it to Nathan, but he needed to have it just in case. By the time he reached the transfer station, his knuckles were stiff from gripping the seat. A teenager had offered him a place to sit. He nodded, accepted, and said, "Thank you," with the kind of sincerity that made the young man stand a little taller afterward. Respect, Franklin had always believed, was the cheapest form of honor, but the rarest to find. When he finally arrived at the small roadside diner, he checked his watch. 12:08, plenty of time. He entered with care, surveying the room, wood-paneled walls, booths worn from decades of elbows and laughter, and a jukebox that probably hadn't worked since the Reagan administration. He smiled to himself. Nathan would like it. He found a corner booth and sat, placing his canvas bag beside him like a comrade in arms. His knees ached fiercely now, but he didn't show it. Instead, he straightened his back and waited. Franklin Ward had been sitting for no more than 5 minutes when a young man in a maroon apron sauntered over to his table. He looked barely 20, tall and wiry with spiked hair and a kind of smirk that came pre-installed on kids who'd never been taught the weight of silence. The name tag read Troy. Without a greeting, Troy pulled out a worn notepad and clicked his pen twice in rapid succession. "You ordering or just squatting?" he asked, eyes still glued to the paper. Franklin looked up slowly, unfazed. "Just a coffee for now. My son will be joining me shortly." Troy glanced at him, finally taking in the older man's presence, the faded olive jacket, the creased khakis, the canvas bag tucked beside his seat like a soldier waiting for orders. "Minimum order's $10, Troy said flatly. "This isn't a waiting room." Franklin nodded, reaching calmly for his wallet. "Then I'll have a sandwich, too. That should cover it." His fingers shook slightly as he opened the old leather fold. Inside, a few crumpled bills and a small handful of coins. His monthly pension, mostly spent on medicine and utilities. What remained was enough for coffee, but not for both coffee and pride. He looked up, his expression unchanged. "I seem to be a little short at the moment, but my son, Colonel Nathan Ward, he's arriving shortly. He'll settle our check." Troy snorted. "Sure he is." Franklin's tone didn't waver. "He's on leave from Fort Liberty. This is the only hour we'll have together." "Right. And I'm the governor of Georgia." Troy leaned over the table, voice louder now, sharp enough to turn heads in nearby booths. "Get out if you can't pay, old man. We're not a shelter." A hush fell over the diner. Franklin blinked slowly, absorbing the insult. His knuckles tightened slightly against the edge of the table, but his voice remained even. "I'm not asking for charity. I'm simply waiting for my son." "Yeah, well, wait somewhere else," Troy snapped, reaching for the canvas bag. "Let's see if this can cover your bill." Before Franklin could react, the server dumped the contents onto the table. A small wooden box hit the surface with a dull thud. A handful of military medals spilled out, bronze star, silver star, a combat infantryman badge. A few black and white photographs fluttered after them. One showing a younger Franklin standing shoulder to shoulder with 2 men in dress blues. All 3 were saluting. One bore the stripes of a general. "Stop that," Franklin said, his voice firmer now. "Those are personal." Troy didn't flinch. "So is our time, and you're wasting it." He began shoving the items back into the bag carelessly, folding the medals against one another like loose hardware. Franklin moved to intervene, but as he stood, his knee buckled. He stumbled hard. His right shoulder hit the edge of the table, and he crumpled toward the ground. His wallet fell from his grasp, bursting open. A photo slid across the tile floor. A man in full military dress uniform, stars on his collar, arm wrapped around Franklin in a tight, proud clasp. No one moved. Not the mother with 2 young boys watching from a booth by the window. Not the couple who had just gone quiet mid-bite. Not the older man reading a newspaper, who now shifted slightly behind it, pretending not to see. Franklin didn't cry out. He didn't groan. With the same deliberate care he once used on the battlefield, he picked up his things. First the medals, then the photo, then the bag. His hands were steady now, all trembling on. The training kicked in just like it always had. He got to his feet slowly, drawing in a single breath, back straight, eyes forward, dignity intact, even in the face of public silence. Troy rolled his eyes. "Look, I don't have time for this. Just go." Franklin didn't respond. He simply turned, walked toward the exit, and pushed open the glass door into the cold afternoon sun. Behind him, the clatter of silverware resumed. Conversations picked back up. The humiliation of a veteran faded like background noise. But one person hadn't forgotten. Amy, a young waitress, barely in her 20s, had been watching the entire time from behind the counter. She had seen the medals. She had seen the fall. She had also seen the indifference, and it made her stomach turn. She moved toward Troy, voice low but urgent. "You didn't have to do that." Troy laughed. "Please, another freeloader." He was lying. "He wasn't lying," she snapped. "That man's son is a Special Forces colonel. I recognize the insignia in the photo." "Well, good for him," Troy replied with a shrug. "Still doesn't mean the guy gets a free lunch." Amy's eyes narrowed. It wasn't about the lunch. It was about basic human decency. He turned his back, wiping down the counter with aggressive strokes. "Save the lecture, sweetheart. You want to give him charity? Do it on your break." Amy didn't respond. She just stared out the window, watching Franklin's slow figure cross the parking lot. Out by the edge, he stopped, pulled open the door of a public phone booth, yes, one of the last still standing in town, and stepped inside. She couldn't hear the call, couldn't hear what was said, but she watched the way he stood after it, straighter than before, as if something was coming, and it was. The payphone crackled as Franklin slid one of his quarters into the slot. It was one of only 3 he had left, and he'd hesitated before using it, not because of the cost, but because of what it represented. He had lived his entire life trying not to burden anyone, especially his son. "Fort Liberty Operations," came the sharp voice on the other end. Franklin cleared his throat. "This is Franklin Ward. I need to speak with Colonel Nathan Ward. Authentication code Sierra November 572. There was a pause. "I stand by for secure connection." Seconds passed, then a click. A familiar voice broke through the static, steady, calm, but with a note of urgency. "Dad, you all right? I'm 10 minutes out." Franklin hesitated. "There's been a situation." Nathan's tone shifted instantly. "What kind of situation?" "I don't want to cause a fuss," Franklin said quietly. "But I was asked to leave the diner. Apparently, I didn't meet the minimum order. It got a little messy." There was a moment of silence on the line. Then Nathan's voice dropped into what his soldiers called his command register. "Where are you right now?" "At the east side of the parking lot, phone booth next to the dumpster." "Don't move." Click. Franklin hung up the receiver and stepped out of the booth, blinking up at the overcast sky. The wind was picking up. He zipped up his field jacket, adjusted the canvas strap on his shoulder, and stood quietly exactly where he'd said he would. 8 minutes later, the first sound of approaching rotor blades echoed through the town. At first, no one in the diner noticed. The televisions buzzed, the forks clinked, and Troy was back to taking orders with his usual disinterest. Amy, however, looked up, her eyes darting to the window. A gust of wind blew napkins off a nearby table as a Black Hawk helicopter began descending toward the far side of the parking lot. By the time the landing gear touched the pavement, dust and leaves were swirling through the air, plastering themselves to the glass. Diners rose from their seats in disbelief, some pressing their hands to the windows. Phones emerged from pockets, mouths gaped. The noise was deafening. It wasn't just a military arrival. It was a statement. From the belly of the aircraft, Colonel Nathan Ward stepped down. He wasn't wearing a uniform. Not today. Just a dark tailored suit that couldn't hide the stiffness in his stance or the coiled energy in his movements. He had the bearing of a man used to combat zones and classified quarters. And yet, he walked like he belonged nowhere more than right here, right now. Two military police officers stepped out behind him, flanking a stern woman in glasses, holding a leather folder, the base's legal affairs officer. Nathan's eyes scanned the lot and found his father standing tall, waiting exactly where he said he would. No trace of complaint on his face, just that familiar quiet steadiness Nathan had tried to emulate his entire life. They walked to each other with no words, a firm grasp of shoulders. That was enough. "You all right?" Nathan asked. "I'm fine," Franklin replied. "Just a little embarrassed." Nathan's jaw flexed. "That can be fixed." He turned to the officers and nodded once. Then he headed for the diner. Inside, Troy was halfway through an order of eggs and hash browns when silence overtook the room again. This time, not from insult, but from presence. The door opened. Nathan entered first, followed by the two MPs and the legal officer, who stepped forward and addressed the room with the kind of tone that made silence seem like law. "We are here regarding an incident involving Mr. Franklin Ward, veteran, decorated instructor, and protected individual under Title 38, United States Code." Greg Harris, the owner, emerged from the back, wiping his hands with a towel. "What's going on?" Nathan stepped forward now, calm and composed. "That man you threw out?" He trained over 3,000 Special Forces operators, including myself, and two of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He received the Silver Star for gallantry and action. He served this country longer than most people in this room have been alive. Troy, standing near the coffee station, paled. "I didn't know. I mean, he didn't say." "You weren't supposed to know who he was," Nathan interrupted. "You were supposed to treat every person with basic dignity. Rank shouldn't matter. Uniforms don't make someone worthy. Humanity does." The room held its breath. The legal officer stepped forward again, handing Greg a sealed packet. "This establishment is being placed under temporary suspension pending investigation. Under state and federal veteran protection statutes and per executive order issued by the governor's office, you are to vacate within 30 minutes. "This is outrageous," Greg stammered. "We didn't even touch him." Nathan stepped closer. "He fell because your employee pulled him by the arm and spilled his possessions across the floor in front of everyone. Not one of you helped. Not one. You all watched it happen." Amy finally stepped out from behind the counter, voice trembling. "I tried to speak up." Nathan held up a hand. "I know you're not the reason we're here." Then he turned, scanning the customers. "Each of you had a choice, and in that moment, you chose silence." One MP moved to the door and began taping up a red seal with a federal insignia. The other photographed the space. Nathan turned to leave, pausing only once. "My father taught me that leadership isn't about orders. It's about protection. You defend those who can't defend themselves. Today, none of you did." Outside, the wind had calmed. Franklin stood beside the Blackhawk, watching the doors close behind his son. As Nathan reached him, Franklin gave a small shake of the head. "You really didn't have to do all this." Nathan took off his service cap and knelt just briefly in front of his father. "You taught me how to stand up, Dad," he said quietly. "Today was just my turn." Behind them, the town stood still. No applause, no headlines, just a moment of recognition between a soldier and the man who shaped him. They boarded the helicopter side by side and lifted off into a sky that had forgotten how to ignore a man like Franklin Ward. It didn't take long. By the time Colonel Nathan Ward and his father were airborne, someone had already uploaded the footage to social media. A teenager at the back booth, phone barely raised above the ketchup bottle, had caught nearly the entire confrontation on video from the moment Nathan entered to the final words he left behind. And when he said, "You weren't supposed to know who he was. You were supposed to treat every human being with dignity," it hit something raw and buried in millions of people. Within 6 hours, the video had been viewed over 5 million times. Within 24, it had crossed into national news. CNN ran a headline, "The quiet man who trained our strongest, Franklin Ward, 83, in the diner that forgot honor." Fox News followed with a primetime segment titled "Service Forgotten, Why We Still Owe Our Veterans." ABC News produced a longer feature called "The Teacher Behind the Leaders, Who's Teaching Us Now." Clips of Franklin's medals clattering across the floor played on loop. Analysts, veterans, and ethicists debated what the incident revealed. Not about military service, but about how everyday Americans had grown numb to it. Comment sections filled with reflections, apologies, and outrage. That could have been my dad. If this is how we treat our heroes, we don't deserve them. I served under a man trained by Franklin Ward. His fingerprints are on everything good in our unit. The hashtag surged, hashtag Franklin Ward, hashtag silent valor, hashtag respect the elder. This is leadership. Students in high schools began discussing it in civics classes. A fifth-grade class in Ohio collected handwritten letters and mailed them in a leather-bound album. One letter read, "Dear Mr. Ward, thank you for teaching your son how to stand up. When I grow up, I want to be like both of you." Mia, age 10. A military academy in Colorado replayed the clip of Nathan's speech during leadership training, reminding cadets, honor isn't just for ceremonies. It's for how you treat the quietest person in the room. But the most unexpected reaction came from those who had never worn a uniform. Ordinary citizens who saw something in Franklin they'd forgotten in themselves. James Cooper, a marketing executive who'd been dining at a nearby table during the incident, wrote an op-ed in his local paper. "I was too absorbed in my emails to notice what was happening. I watched a man fall, someone who shaped warriors, and I didn't stand up. That silence will stay with me. I'm part of the problem. But I intend to be part of the change." Even Troy, the server who had humiliated Franklin, issued a public statement through a lawyer. "I made a terrible mistake. I judged someone by his wallet instead of his worth. I deeply regret my actions." But Franklin Ward never demanded apologies. In fact, when asked by a local journalist if he sought justice, he simply replied, "Justice isn't about punishment. It's about showing people a better way forward." He declined all interview requests. Back in Georgia, Franklin's life returned to its usual rhythm. He still raised the flag at dawn. Still walked, albeit slower, to the Veterans Center every Thursday. Still listened more than he spoke. The only change, the walls of the center, once bare and dim, were now filled with photos mailed in from soldiers across the country. Some had trained under him. Others trained under those who had. Every single one wrote a message on the back. "Your standards built my backbone. You never met me, but your lessons did. Thank you for making better men." One morning, the town's mayor arrived at Franklin's doorstep with a group of local officials. Quietly, respectfully, they informed him that the high school auditorium was being renamed in his honor. Franklin Ward Hall. Franklin tried to decline politely twice. Then after a moment, he said, "If it inspires just one young person to treat the next man with dignity, go ahead." And so they did. Meanwhile, Colonel Nathan Ward remained characteristically silent in the public eye. When finally pressed by a national outlet to comment, he issued only one written statement. "The uniform comes off eventually, but the values shouldn't. My father didn't raise a soldier. He raised a man who knew when to act." It went viral, not because it was flashy, but because it was true. From the ashes of humiliation in a small roadside diner, a national conversation reignited. Not just about veterans, but about everyday decency, about how easily we forget and how powerfully we remember when someone dares to stand up. And it had all begun not with a speech or a camera or a plan, but with a quiet old man in a worn jacket who still believed that dignity was something you carry even when no one's looking. 6 months had passed since the helicopter landed outside the diner. The dust had settled, but the memory had not. The diner itself never reopened. Its faded signage remained, a kind of ghostly reminder, not of shame, but of a turning point. Locals still glanced at it when driving by. They didn't talk about it much anymore, but the story lived on in changed hearts, in quieter moments of conscience, and in the way people treated one another when no one else was watching. Franklin Ward, true to form, never once mentioned the incident. Not to his neighbors, not to his friends at the Veterans Center, not even to Nathan. He didn't need to. The world had spoken for him. At the center, volunteers had doubled, then tripled. Young men and women from nearby towns signed up to serve meals, run errands, or just sit beside a veteran and listen. The chairs, once half filled with quiet grief, were now surrounded by conversation and laughter. Not because anything had gotten easier, but because one man's quiet dignity had reminded everyone that service doesn't end with a uniform, and respect shouldn't either. Among those volunteers was Amy, the young waitress who had watched the whole event unfold and couldn't let it go. One day, she arrived in a crisp blouse and slacks, holding a folded paper with a government seal. Her hands trembled as she handed it to Franklin. "I've been accepted," she said. "Officer Candidate School. I ship out in 2 weeks." Franklin looked up from the bin of coats he'd been folding, pausing long enough to study her expression. He saw a mixture of fear and conviction and recognized both. "Why now?" he asked gently. "Because I saw what leadership looks like," she replied. "And I want to be someone who doesn't look away when it matters." Franklin nodded. "You already are." Before she left for training, he handed her a small wooden box, old, scratched, and worn smooth on the corners, inside his brass field compass, and a handwritten note. "If ever you lose your way, don't ask where you are. Ask who you are." Troy, the young server who had humiliated Franklin, was also given a chance, though not in the way he had hoped. In lieu of formal charges, a judge approved a community resolution, 6 months of service at the Veterans Center under Franklin's supervision. At first, Troy arrived sullen and silent, his presence a sore reminder to some. But Franklin treated him no differently than any new volunteer. No lectures, no bitterness, just quiet expectations. Over time, the change was subtle, but real. He began listening. He sat beside a triple amputee for over an hour one afternoon, just hearing about his time in Afghanistan. He helped fix a broken heater without being asked. He stayed after hours once to repaint the scuffed hallway. No one saw it, but Franklin did. One day, near the end of his service, Troy approached Franklin during cleanup. "You could have ruined me," he said, not making eye contact. "But you didn't." "Why?" Franklin placed another folded blanket on the shelf. "Because sometimes a second chance is more powerful than a first impression." Troy nodded slowly. "You taught me that, without ever raising your voice." A year after the incident, the mayor of the town stood on a stage in front of the newly renamed high school auditorium. Franklin Ward Hall. Franklin was in attendance, but only because Nathan had personally driven down to ensure he didn't try to sneak out of it. When presented with a plaque, Franklin kept his words brief. "This isn't about me. It's about remembering who we should be every day to strangers, to veterans, to each other." In Franklin's home, a single letter now hung on the wall, once kept in his drawer for years. It was from Nathan, dated nearly 2 decades earlier. "Whenever I faced a hard choice overseas, I'd ask myself, what would Dad do?" That question never failed me. Across from it, a small wooden sign that Amy had carved herself before shipping off to basic training. "Character isn't what you preach, it's what you protect." Franklin Ward never sought recognition. He never marched or shouted or demanded change. He simply stood. And in doing so, he reminded a town and eventually a country that true strength is quiet. It does not swagger. It does not threaten. It teaches not through speeches, but through example. And sometimes the man you dismiss as just an old veteran turns out to be the moral backbone you didn't know your community had forgotten until he helped it find its way again. In the quiet dignity of Franklin Ward, we saw something we don't see enough of anymore. Not noise, not protest, not anger, but principle. He didn't ask for revenge. He didn't demand recognition. He simply stood. And because he did, others remembered how to stand, too. This story isn't just about one veteran and one diner. It's about something bigger. A national memory that too often forgets the people who built the very freedoms we enjoy. In today's world where we often judge by appearance, by income, by status, Franklin's story reminds us the person you overlook might be the very one who once carried the weight of your safety or raised the man who does now. So here's the question. What does dignity look like in your world? And when was the last time you stood up for someone? Not because of what they could do for you, but because it was right. We'd love to hear your stories. Have you ever witnessed someone being mistreated because of how they looked, dressed, or struggled? Have you ever stepped in or maybe wished you had? Let us know in the comments. Your story might help someone else find the courage to act. We share stories like these to remind each other that character still matters, that respect isn't old-fashioned, it's foundational, and that sometimes the quietest people leave the loudest legacy. Thank you for watching and for listening all the way through. If this story moved you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who still believes in decency. Together, we keep these stories and their lessons alive. Until next time, take care of one another and never underestimate the strength of someone walking alone, carrying a quiet dignity. This has been Valor Stories.